Thank you all for turning up. I know it's early in the morning and parties were wild last night. I don't blame you if you're feeling, and I do apologize if you feel like you're going to be learning a lot, because you are. If before you got out of school because of Furry fandom, guess again. So what's this talk about? So for those who don't know me, I'm Game Popper. I started researching furry history at around 2017, and I didn't really know anything much. I wasn't an academic of any kind. I'm self-taught. So I basically just started doing my own research into UK furry history. That eventually led to a talk in 2019 here at ConFuzzled, a bunch of articles, and then eventually I have my own book, which should be coming out in July. Hopefully, if it doesn't push back again because of editor or Amazon. But essentially what this talk is going to be about is basically just like what I've learned. Think of it like a writing furry fiction panel, except for non-fiction. And I've got 60 minutes or less to do it, so no pressure to me. And also, don't worry, I'm not going to try and go over anything too overly complicated or academic. Are there any history academics in here, out of curiosity? Okay, good. So no one's going to school me.
You could lie to us.
Well, okay, so the first obvious question is, what do we consider history? So this is the Cambridge Dictionary definition. Study a record of past events considered together, especially events of particular period, country, or subjects. But it's not, history is not like this event happened on this day, then this event happened on this day, and going on in an order. There's a word for that, it's called a chronology. History differs more in that you're telling a story, by matter of obvious fact that story's kind of in its name. But it's also more important to know that we use like facts, like stories based around facts and evidence and what actually happened. That's what sets it apart from mythology and such. And especially we don't want to get into the realm of like conspiracy theories or lies or anything that's really politically motivated. But it's really just understanding, how did we get here? But another thing that people often misunderstand about history is that there's often assume that it's about like wars, it's about famous battles, it's about famous politicians or monarchies. No, really, history can really be about anything. If you have a history in anything, there is a history behind it, a history of like how it got there, and it's a history that I feel like is worth studying. For instance, furries, or more specifically, British furries. But what can this history? Well, there are plenty of examples, as you can see right here. So we have convention panels. I don't know if any of you saw the two old furries QA yesterday. Cy and Rodney, two America's founding fathers, directors of the conference, and talked about like their experiences in the early days of the fandom. But you also have like the recent documentary, The Fandom by the Two Ashes. There's Causality After. Fang Feather and Fin is a furry history blog. Rambling Over Grey Muzzle, that's a podcast by some British furries from the early days. But I don't know, there's amounts of all these, so you don't have to do just writing. It could just be talking about history. But say you wanted to start a history project, but you need to know where to start. I mean, the main obvious one is like, what's your topic? So, like I mentioned earlier, history can be about anything. It doesn't have to be about the wars and the battles and the politics, but you got to pick a subject. So I have here like several examples that could apply to history. Best advice, it'd be try doing something that you already have an interest or some sort of investment in. So I chose British furries because I'm a British furry. I've been going to like fur meets and conventions for 10, 15 years. So I already have that experience, already have that know my way around and know like where to start looking for stuff. But if you're into like furry art, or if you're interested in like, dance competitions or paw pets, focusing on those would be good. If you're starting out, try your best to pick a narrow topic. You could do like really broad ones that could be very daunting. I'm just going on experience. If you decide to pick a topic, you next need to go into research. Although I have my own term, and that's pre-research. The best way I can describe research is knowing what you're looking for before you actually start looking. It's like the planning before the research phase. You basically just got to answer two questions. What do you already know? And what do other historians already know? Think about like what your basic idea of your topic is, about how to ever look it up. And this is what's like the common knowledge. What's the facts that you don't need to or don't think you need to look up in order to know? And what about other historians have written about it? Have there been any articles? Are there any papers? Are any books? Any documentaries? Look into them, and also more importantly, like look into their sources. Look at where they've already done the research. Just a side note on sources, there are many things that can be considered sources, but it's best to like break them down into 3 different categories. First one are the primary sources. This is essentially the sources are from the time of the events you're talking about, or at least they were by the people who were actually part of the event. So this is like the personal accounts. If there were any videos of the event, any photographs of the event, if there were journals or any autobiographies or any direct interviews about what that happened. These are kind of like the most reliable sources of information you can find. But that's assuming that the author is both honest and reliable, which is where we get into the secondary sources. So these are the sources that are typically written after the fact and usually rely on multiple primary sources. This is the stuff like news articles or any like biographies written by another person or even documentaries. So they may not be as reliable, they may not be a direct source of information, but primary sources have the benefit of like interpreting based on multiple primary sources, multiple different sources of information, and scrutinizing them in order to find out what's more likely to have happened than not. So like for my book and my history writing, I would rely on both of these. But there's also one more, and that's tertiary sources. Tertiary sources essentially revolves around artwork, but the main way to think about tertiary sources is that these use secondary sources to present present an event figure, but they don't exactly like teach you much about what has happened. It's because of that, it's not really valuable history. It's not really something that you would cite, but sometimes it's a good thing to show. What does this event or this person represent in the current cultural mindset or the cultural mindset of the time? So, for example, if there are any songs that talk about a certain event, that usually tells you what people would thought about that event at the time. But also tertiary sources can be stuff like textbooks and encyclopedias, so general information banks, which brings me to another side note. Yeah, don't use wikis. Well, also technically do. So, for the record, I do kind of use wikis, but not for like heavy research. It's usually for like if I need to check a date of a certain thing, or check a location, check a certain name. But if I want to know the exact details, then I do my heavy research elsewhere. The whole point of a wiki page is to be that tertiary baseline understanding of an event. Even Wikipedia says don't use us as a source. You should be doing your own research. But wikis do have their uses. For instance, wikis will often provide their references, and historians are known to source mine through encyclopedias in order to get to sources for information that they may not feel like I need every exact bit of detail for. But also wikis do have their own forums and communities who are discussing in like the reliability of certain information, or because wikis try and aim to be as accurate as possible, even with the risk of bias and reliability. I've also found for Wikifirst specifically, there were pages about certain events that were written by the people who did those events or edited by the people who did those events. So I found looking through the history edits to see like what those people thought about their own conventions or their own events. Those I found useful. So you've done your pre-research. Now it's kind of like structure what you're going to write about, which I'm going to hope I get to show this. So this doc here was basically my notes for when I started doing this history research all the way to doing my talk in 2019. I basically created a timeline and a Word document, like basically my own chronology, where I have the year, I write down, and in brief descriptions like what happened in those years relevant to British furries. I basically just went into a lot of depth to try and make sure I covered everything, and I also include like lists of all the furry conventions I can find, all the furmies I can find, any other specific events or things of relevance like early fursuiters, and I also kept like my notes here and some of my original interviews here. But yeah, in conclusion, basically you might have your own way to plan out your like outline. Some people do like timelines like I do. Some people just like write like summary blocks of like what each chapter should cover. But whatever helps you structure the history you're telling, do that. Then you get into the actual research history. And some advice, whenever I went out to do research, I always had a notepad with me. And anytime I find an interesting source, I'd write down its name, who named the author, any relevant quotes, any relevant additional sources to look into, any relevant information that could be found. And also, be sure to evaluate your sources. Remember, not all authors are inherently reliable. Make sure you understand who the author is, determine how much of an expert they can be. Also, when the source is, because primary sources tend to be more reliable close to when the actual event happened, because memory is a fickle thing. It can change and deteriorate over time. Secondary sources, though, I find to be more reliable if they're more recent, because then they take in more and more information. Oh yeah, whenever you're doing your research, you may find out some new information that you didn't realize before, and it can completely change your outline and your topic. So yeah, be prepared to change what you write a lot. Also, organize your research. I don't know how many students are on here, but yeah, whenever you're writing your next thesis or your next project and you're relying on sources, use Zotero. So Zotero is a source organizing tool that lets you input individual sources as sets of names and the dates in them. They have plugins that can let you output to be proper citations and bibliographies. It's essentially the free and open source version of EndNote, if you know of it. Britannia itself had around 500 sources in its bibliography alone.
Can you say the name again?
So it's Zotero, Zotero. Zotero.
We're a little bit late. Is it all right to raise the hands to ask questions, or do we wait until the
Sure, in the end if possible.
Yes, sorry.
Hopefully there'll be time for questions, but I can hang around for half an hour after the talk. No, that's all. So
these are some very outdated terms that might be I've been in the fandom since 2017, and I have never actually heard a word that's frequently used in Wiki will have to need to recon. Yeah.
In fairness, Wikifur, I think it got started in the mid 2000s, and that was when it was used at its peak, and usership had gone down ever since. So a lot of the terminology used were ones that were common in those mid to late 2000s.
You see, grain was a lot, but this is a grain was locked. I've never heard someone leave for the Trump meetings when they were to grain. Yeah, it's like you don't say it. I'm hearing the latest. I hear it. I think it's the shit that comic kitties do. It's in the corner.
Well,
I don't like that.
Anyway, so you're saying you've got a question?
Wikifur can be very, very, very outdated because someone can update it once and then just forget about it. There's a Norwegian furry I know. I looked him up and it said he was 25 and he's now 35. So people don't update it very well.
Yeah. Okay, well here's where you go about to find proper sources of information. So starting off, library. So this photo here is of the British Library in London. I've been there quite a number of times. In fact, I even have it in my wallet. Yep. This is my library card. And it's actually not that expensive. I think it's between £5 to £10, but it basically gives you reading access to all the books, including the rare ones that they had to get from their deep archives and they have to bring out in a box, and you can only read them in certain restricted areas of the rare books route. On top of that, they also have their own collection of videos and audio, newspapers, and JSTOR access, which again, if you're a student, JSTOR is a huge database of academic papers and academic journals. So if you're not a student, you can get your access at some libraries. He's not just a British library. I use it as because it's the biggest library in the world, and I was able to read a lot of the original magazines that talked about the furries in it. But it's a popular one. But I recommend getting a library card because I'm glad people caught them.
Libraries are awesome.
So other places, archives. So this is a box of furry fanzines and comics that is from the Sea Riverside Library. On libraries that it's more by appointment. You have to arrange ahead of time if you want to see certain things in the archives. But they're generally, you'll find rare documents that probably wouldn't be available to buy publicly. Unfortunately, like there are Furry related archives like EC Riverside, but they're all based in the US. So, but fortunately, I do know like a couple of researchers who I could just like send an email if I wanted to like certain documents scanned. So museums allow you to see rare documents in person. So some are free to access, some are not. This is the Causality Museum in London.
I'm in there. That's good.
Oh yeah, I've been there too.
I went there a few years ago.
So yeah, you get to see like original artwork. So you have a J.J. Granville at the top, John Tenniel, Alice in Wonderland artwork, and you got David comic strip and Danger Mouse. Private collections. So if you know the right people, you can also find people who just keep a lot of rare material. So these are some fanzines from one of the 90s furs, Simon Barber. So a fanzine is basically a fan-produced magazine.
Yeah.
They're usually made by like people like saying like their writings or their artwork to one person who then manually puts it together and then distributes out the magazine together. Some of these are like only held together like with like crude bindings. Some of them are really thick. So here's some like comics and a fanzine called the Furry Press Network, which also has some original writings from Fred Patton. Emails. So sometimes you just have to contact the people you need to directly. General advice here, remember, these are people. You really don't want to give them the impression of like the creepy guy who wants to talk about some weird obscure thing that you did like 10, 15 years ago. I once made the mistake of telling my friend I found some messages from him from the mailing list back in 2005. He's not forgiven me. But my general approach is basically just be upfront and honest. Tell them like who you are, that you're doing this project. You're currently doing research in this area. You found currently from your research you were involved. Would it be alright if you can ask questions? And some of them are like, we'll be happy to oblige and answer any questions you have. But if they don't, just respect their wishes. Maybe give them like a few weeks and prod them. But like, if there's no response, like there's not really much you can do, unfortunately. But finally, you can find a lot of good research on the internet. So places like libraries and archives do have their own internet resources, but Furry Fandom is an internet-based fandom. So a lot of alt websites, mailing lists, and user groups, they have their uses, and people like use YouTube to like upload their old videos of conventions and such, as well as, and we also have like Furry news sites. So we still have like have that the articles from like back in like the early 2000s that can be really helpful. Also, there's the Wayback Machine, so you can look at an old websites from like several years ago. So that's the ConFuzzled website from 2007.
Oh wow!
But I think ConFuzzled maybe only had it about 2008.
No. So this went online like about a year before the ConFuzzled 2008 for registrations and stuff.
And these were back then.
136.
And now going to like over 2,000.
Yeah.
Would I have believed that if you future and that they're free kind of cow?
I have to say even like it's in 2008, like Eurofronts was like nearing 1,000 by that, and Eurofronts have been around for like over 13 years at that point.
Wow.
So they probably would have been really happy that the convention was such a success they got to continue this long.
And you mentioned there used to be a dose about UK cons because everyone kind of struggled to organise.
Yes, because there were a lot of failed conventions in the past. So I figured I'd entertain you a bit more. So this is a story of like how far, so most of the time when I need to find information, it's like a single search or a single visit to a library and I find it. This is the kind of more intense one. So I'll give a story out. So this was back in January 2022. I go through like the Frozen media timeline and I find this one line that totally missed my attention beforehand. So Key talked about his furriness on Channel 4 show Frontal. And this gave me a lot of questions like, it was Key, what is Frontal? When exactly did it end? Because it says September 2000, but like there's like 30 days in September. And we don't even know what time. And also, how did this interview come about? So I did start doing my usual digging, like searching for Key on like Fur Affinity, Old Fan Furry, see if I know who they are. Look for it, search for any details on the show Frontal, also I know it's on Channel 4, but not really that much I could find. Like, I couldn't find a furry named Key, it doesn't pop, but there's only 2 left. I couldn't find any show mention of Frontal, not on the usual places, not even on Channel 4's website. Sometimes if I'm lucky, I could find like access to TV guides. They could probably give me more specific information. I couldn't find a Channel 4 one from that period. So I wasn't sure about if the show could even exist. I couldn't even find any clips on YouTube originally until I found something on Reddit. So for context, this is a subreddit called Tip of My Tongue where people explain like, hey, I remember this like show, or I remember this video game, or I remember this film. It has all this detail, but I can't figure the name of it. Could someone help me? And then usually someone in the comments would find the answer. And when someone was here talking about this some late night show from the 90s on Channel 4, someone came up with the answer, Frontal, and gave me this wonderful detailed description that also provided links to clips from the pilot, which was aired in 1999. But basically what it told me, essentially, was that Frontal was this live show that took place at Channel 4's headquarters. It was aired on the Before Later block, which was like from like midnight to like 2 o'clock in the morning. And it had 5 episodes in 2000. However, I couldn't really find any episode details, so I couldn't tell if there was any actual episode of a furry, and I couldn't find any information on Key. But at least I knew the show definitely existed, which means my next protocol was to look for an archive. Channel 4 unfortunately doesn't have like a public archive, but there's this next best thing, and that's the British Film Institute. This is the charitable organisation that archives all the British film and TV. And they have like several mediatheks around the country. There's one in Birmingham in the Central Library, and I think there's also one in the Manchester Central Library too. So I went to their website, searched for archives, and hooray! They do have all 5 episodes in their archives. Woo! But there's no episode descriptions. Funny enough, yes, but ultimately what happened? I basically filled out their viewing form, telling them I'm researching furry media. There's a show called Frontal. It has an interview with furry in one of the episodes. I don't know which episode exactly, but I to view them. BFI got back to me and said that they did have one episode that was already available to viewing, but the rest of them were still on their Betamax tapes and had to be digitized, which cost 50 quid in total.
Oh, each individually.
In total.
Oh, it's because the BBC used to up doing a thing called junking, didn't they? Oh yeah.
That was more like from early days up until like the 70s, fortunately. But it was still a thing that happened.
And I got like 50 missing episode of Doctor Who, because that would be really cool.
But here's the other thing. So, like I said, there are mediatheks all around the country. So I did say, can I watch these at the mediathek in Manchester Central Library? Because then I could just go on the tram and visit there. I said, unfortunately, the Manchester Mediathek only shows regional specific content. There's only one place that they could show it, and that's in London, BFI South Bank. So I had to take a train all the way to London.
Oh no.
But I went to their Mediathek, and like they told me, they managed to transfer it all. And you wouldn't believe your luck. Gee, I wonder which one has the furry in it. Let me help make it clearer for you. I was laughing to myself in that video chat. I thought, oh great, I'm going to be spending all day watching 5 episodes just to find one interview. No.
And then you just see it from center.
Yeah. But so, unfortunately, these are going to be very poor quality because I had to make photos off the screen. I couldn't take the digital copies down. But yeah, people probably haven't seen this show in 20 years. So yeah, this is fun. So as I said, took place live at London's headquarters. This is the year 2000, by the way. But it was still a very pioneering show. Like they had viewers could live chat to anyone at the headquarters at the time. They also showed band music videos. They had various news segments on various subjects that weren't really common at the time. They had a segment on LGBT activists, mercenaries. They had one on credit fraud, which in the early 2000s was not that common in the UK as it is now. They also had reviews of physical apparatus.
Oh, the guy's so sad.
But relevant for the furry fandom and your intro, I got to see this. And you notice there on the bottom corner, it said alt lifestyle furry. So here's a thought on my part. When I initially did my research, I did not think to look into alt lifestyle furry. I only went to alt fan furry because I figured at first in the media they would ban them or talk to it on there. But afterwards, I decided to go to alt fan furry and just do a simple search for frontal. And I found this post from Cheeky talking about, I'm about to do this interview on the show called Frontal. The Frontal's about this. Also, I was approached by a producer and I'm going to be talking about this and this and this and this. Had I found this out earlier, I would have found out the exact air date, which means I would have only had to digitally transport one episode. I would have saved like about 40 quid. There's a quote from, I don't know if any of you know of like CGP Grey on YouTube. He does educational content. He does a lot of research. He did like one really good episode about his like strive with like researching this one single poem. There's a quote on there. You only know at the end what is the fastest way from the beginning. So yeah, if I had found out first, my journey would have been so much quicker. Also, another thing, I went to London on a Saturday in March. Guess what also happened on Saturday that March? I did not know there was a London phone meet until the day after I got back. But well, like, it was all or nothing. I basically updated the record, so now Frontal has its own page on Wikifair. I wrote about it in a fanzine called Thurbzine. I also included it in my book, Canyon. So now there's one interview that was only like a single sentence on Wikifair. Now it has a lot more information about it. And you got these pleasure to see some of it. So, assuming that you've done all your research, or at least most of your research, let's quickly go on to writing. So, things you have to keep in mind when you're writing history is who your target audience is. So, in the field of history writing, which goes by the term historiography, there's three kinds of history. But think of historiography as a spectrum, but there's three core ones you need to think of. So, on the one side, you have pop history. So, for example, there we have Joe Strike's Furry Names. This is a history that is written specifically for general audience, the mainstream. It might not use like the most complicated terms. It might give very broad information, so that like if you've been a very long, if you read and like, yeah, I already know this, can we get to the good stuff? Yeah, I already know this. But Furry Names and Joe Strike kind of wrote it to people who didn't know what furries were before this. It may be a little bit alienating for like people who are already interested in furry history and such. There's also a risk of it being derivative. Joe Strike rarely ever fell into this, but there's cases where sometimes it's a quote, but sometimes it can be like a whole academic paper, like written by an academic, but then someone just goes, oh, let me just dumb this down and then release it to the pub. Yeah, there's kind of a risk of plagiarism. I really caught it with like one quote, which I knew Joe Strike got from another book, but didn't credit. But that doesn't really take away it gives a wide-reaching audience. On the other end of the spectrum, you have scholarly history. So I couldn't really find a scholarly history book on furries. So this about fan identities in the furry fandom was a PhD thesis written by a woman who's now a professor at Anglia-Ruskin University studying furry fandom. It's like the opposite end of the spectrum. Scholarly history is history written for scholars, not specifically academics, but people who are really into history and really interested in expanding the knowledge of history. So it has the alternative risk of it being really alienating to general audiences, maybe too complex. I actually own fan identity of the furry fandom, and within the first page I knew I was reading a PhD thesis that I could hardly understand half the words. I still read through it. The study is really interesting, but it was a daunting read, far more daunting than Furry Nation does. But then you also have the middle bit, which is public history. So, for example, here we have Fred Patton's Furry Founder Conventions. Ponyville Confidential, that's a brony history book. Well, actually, no, brony history is only half right. It's an entire history of My Little Pony in popular media, but it does cover in great detail the brony fandom and the My Little Pony fandom. And then is British science fiction. So we're talking, like, because science fiction is old, we're talking science fiction that goes, like, a science fiction fandom that goes all the way back to like the 1930s. My favorite section of it is when it talks about science fiction fandom through the Second World War. You find out that not only like science fiction fans, there were a lot of conscientious objectors, but because these were like young middle class white men who with a lot of interest in math and science, a lot of them that did go into the military went to the Royal Air Force. Also, apparently, in like 1939, American fans didn't really care that much for the British people worrying about the idea of going to war, because they didn't join until like 1941, 1942. Anyway, so what is public history? Public history is the balance between the two. It's the one that you can't find in museums. It's there for general audience, but it goes into far more detail that puts in the scholarly side. This is kind of my intention for Tanya. Like, I wanted to make it accessible to British furries, American furries in general, but I also know that British furry fandom isn't really discussed that much. I kind of wanted to, therefore, make it a significant contribution. So, public history need a good balance. But the risk with public history is that it's a tight balancing act. The way you write can skew yourself one way or the other. You may try to make things too simplified too much, in which you inch into the pop history, but then you may go into one more of the complex details, which may make you lean more to the scholarly angle. My answer concept that I had an academic paper mindset that I needed to get out of, so that kind of tells you where I was leaning a little bit towards when trying to write this. But another thing you also need to consider is whether you want to use citation. So on the one hand, providing your sources does make you trustworthy, does help anyone who also wants to go into their own research, but they are page fillers. Like I said, 500 sources. That's a lot of pages. And off-putting for general readers, yeah, it's like called subjective, but when you're working with an editor who has over 3 decades of experience in the publishing industry, around general audiences, I guess, do you keep in mind that that's kind of a risk? If you do, though, you can try to use a format to make it subtle. So Chicago Manual style is like the standard for scholarly history, but you also have a lot more subtle ones down here below. Again, if you use source organization tools like Zotero, they can do the formatting for you. Another thing to consider, pictures. They help with presenting your history. Try your best to use high quality scans if you can, or even better, if you have access to the raw files or printed proofs. So that's the 2008 con book. And that's the little cast photo for the first Paw Pest shop. I miss Paw Pest.
The back this year.
Yay! But also another thing to keep in mind, particularly with pictures this recent, fair use and copyright, especially if you're doing like stuff that you intend to make money on. Make sure you have the permission, make sure you have the rights to use it. Don't be like me, in which you put in like over 100 images and then find out you have to cut out a third of them because you cannot even contact the original author anymore. Or if you can, they just leave you on read. Also, if you do have a experience writing furry fiction, they do have a lot of transferable skills in order to make your writing quality. The general point here, don't try and go into like broad topics. Try to avoid tangents. Try to keep focused to like your topic and hand. And yeah, prepare for a lot of drafts. I only got picked by my publisher around draft 3 and 4. Also my first draft had like almost over 100,000 words. Basically, by draft 2, I was like, I was told like, yeah, you need to cut this down. So I was like, all right, sat down. How much of this do I need to rewrite? I was able to cut out 20,000 words. Which definitely works in the end because I'm now being published. But for history in general, this is what they teach in historical writing. It's called the 5 stages of historical thinking. Basically, these are 5 stages to make you think like a historian and write appropriately like a historian, which I've got some examples to show. Starts with context. So here's an example. Between 2002 and 2006, there have been several attempts from furries to start a furry convention in the UK. All of them fell through for a variety of reasons, with the most common thread being a lack of experience in running events. It had become frequent enough for the phrase British Furry Convention to become a meme within the UK discussions. As a result, when ConFuzzled was first announced publicly in 2006, despite being run by experienced-friendly organizations under the advice of experienced convention organizers, the initial response went along the lines of, "No one believes it's really going to happen." Boy, were they wrong. But the key thing is that this bit is the context. This is the reason why people thought it wasn't really going to happen. You have to understand the larger picture in order to explain what and why things happen. And without context, you may fall into a trap of hindsight. Like, how could they say that wasn't really going to happen? They were experienced and they knew what they were doing. Well, it's because how many times it failed before. Change over time. This is what helps make the narrative a narrative. This is what helps you avoid just listing events off by order of date. Does anyone know what we call that?
Chronology.
Thank you. If I had a sticker, I'd give it one to you. So, for this example, I could have just started with saying, ConFuzzled started in 2008 at the YAJ International Convention and had diversity X attendees. Next year, same venue, but this time 192 attendees, I think it was. Yeah. And then 2010, moved to this week. But here, instead, I talk about it as if, as a result of its growing attendance, the venue had to move. And because they had new venues, they had new events. And sometimes, because they had so many people, they had to change events to accommodate for this. For example, because there were so many people, they had to change the Fursuit War to the Fursuit Menagerie. But yeah, it's important to detail not only the changes, but also what traditions kept the same. The causality. So every effect has a cause and effect. Think of it like that. So, for example, in 2016, Disney released the film Zootopia, or Zootopolis, which proved popular amongst furries with its anthropomorphic animal setting. One notorious scene involved wolves instinctively starting to howl in groups. In response, when one furry started to howl, Fursuit will respond by joining in until several would howl in unison. When ConFuzzled 2016 came around, the convention played along with this by issuing a woo fines for howling at a penalty cost of £350.
Per person.
Per person. So yeah.
They really do, man.
Oh yeah. There's an actual woo permit in the art show right now. Basically, effect, and that's the cause. Causality, and the effect. Contingency. This is the one that interests me in history in general. Basically, the what if scenario. What if one thing was slightly different that could have changed everything else in the timeline? And so this is one interesting example I found. So in 1999, there was an anime convention in London called Shinenkai, and it had been running since 97, 98, 99. They greenlit a furry track, and which was run by the organizer of one of the UK house cons called Foxy. Foxy was able to have it all planned out with its own video room. There would have been a masquerade, a quiz, dealer's den. Unfortunately, though, Shinenkai was cancelled. It was because the hotel had basically dropped them because there weren't enough rooms being booked. But another unfortunate side effect is that UK Con basically ended afterwards. It was largely because Foxy was no longer a student, which means they no longer had their own accommodation for anyone. And it was a struggle to find new venues, so they ultimately gave up. But the contingency, you think about this. So had there been the furry track, had the anime convention around and there was a furry track, that furry track could have evolved into its own convention zone. Think to a Midwest Fur Fest, takes place in Chicago. It's one of the biggest furry conventions in the world. That started off as a furry track at a science fiction convention called DuckCon. So we could have had a very proper furry convention well before ConFuzzled.
Well, because not exactly. But I can dovetail that in the reverse as a contingency. A lot of science fiction conventions were getting a large furry presence, and they were also getting a very, very on anime setup. This was in Northern California. And what happened was the anime presence got so large that the convention, either nicely or otherwise, said, could you maybe tweet one random elsewhere and not travel on ours all the times? There can be a monographing in all of our pieces. If that had not happened, anime conventions either might not have happened or might not have happened for some time. And if that hadn't happened, furry conventions might not have happened sometime. We might have just sort of fallen this into traditional science fiction event. And it'd been interesting. And
Thank you for that. Okay, so the last C is complexity, which is another one that has a lot of interest in the history field. There's a myth when it comes to history of there being one true story. In reality, there's as many interpretations as there have been people involved. So with very slightly different degrees. It is the aim of history to find the most common threads in order to find the most reliable, but are sometimes unanswered questions. So when the furry fandom began, you could say start with Cy and Rodney's furry parties in the mid-80s, but then you do have Vooty before that. You have some of the other proto-fandoms before that. And you also have Robrazzle. So it very much differs on what you actually consider when a furry community starts. But when did the first furry convention in the UK happen? You can argue ConFuzzled, but there was RBW, but that ran from 2006, 2007. 2007 very much had kind of a convention format. It was in a hotel. It had events scheduled planned. It had a hotel used for accommodation. But I know some people will say, well, is that really a convention, or is it more just a part of the boat party? And they also mentioned that there were some people who thought that the house cons in Yateley or the UK FurCon should be considered conventions themselves. Again, there's a debate to it. Where did the term furry get its name on? I'm aware of Dr. Pepper, is it? Sorry? Was it Dr. Pepper? You say Quantum? Yeah.
It heavily been also batted a fan having BBS and it's he wrote editorials about the Earth editorial Holocaust and was this was totally saying I still that main thing from.
as far as we go.
Yes, as far as we know, because Joe Strike, I believe, found people who said that they used the term furry in some fanzines back in the earlier 80s, but they're not sure who said it first. Essentially, real life isn't simple. There's no one answer to everything. There are some answers more popular than others, but there's always going to be some questions that are unknown. And so be sure to address that where you can. Okay, so let's assume you spend 2-3 years writing away all you can, and then you finally get to a finished book that's ready to publish. So where do you publish? Well, I mean, nowadays it's a lot more easier than ever. You can go through the self-publishing route. Of course, there's YouTube. If you want to go video, you can set up your own website. You can share all your findings on social media. Luby Press is one of many examples of companies that allow you to print your own books, and you can even sell on Amazon and such. But you also have the traditional routes, like talking at conventions and approaching a publisher, publishing to fanzines and news publications. And if you're a writer, you may be aware of the Furry Writers Guild. They're a community dedicated for writing and provide support and advice for those wanting to get into writing furry fiction. They do also provide support for non-fiction as well. But be aware that there are pros and cons to each side. I wanted to go traditional route because I did self-publishing for video games. So I know firsthand that self-publishing is not an easy venture. Even if it comes at the risk of maybe having less creative control. But it's up to you. Yeah. That's mostly what I have. And of course, support your furry historians. So there's not just me, but just to really go through, Culture F is a series on YouTube that do a lot of great documentaries related around furry history. Juniper is a PhD student who's currently working at the UC Riverside Library and will constantly find new things from their archives and helps organize it. Toft, aka Christopher Paul, he's a professor. He teaches more about anthropomorphic art, but he has his own furry history project, Fan, Feather and Fin. Joe Strike, of course, he published Furry Nation, still a great book, highly recommend it. He's still working on a sequel called Furry Planets, which covers like furry fandom from around the world. I had the honor of helping him with the UK chapter. But also, do support the Internet Archive. That's my one main advocacy, because a lot of my book wouldn't be possible if I didn't have a way to access like the old internet pages of the yesteryear. So now it's time for questions, if anyone has any. Yes, Warmate?
If I add one more to your list at the end there, that would be Ash Coyote.
Yeah. Yes, the fandom. Definitely recommend watching the fandom.
On the build, and we're about to get season 2 of the series.
Oh yeah, there's a season of the
Oh, that's kind of anything from the race.
Yay.
Yes.
I'll go. Keep going. Early, late 90s, Virginia, fanzines and stuff. On recoding theory, copy, and put on an archive. And there's lots of copies. But people want it access, you see, because there's only, there'd only been tens of these things printed any time. But fanzines, when they were, actually stuff. Ready recommendation, any is there such thing as an archive? And
So of course there's of course you can upload the works to archive.org. That would be a nice place for everyone. There are the two in America. There's 2 places. There's the Furry Library that's run by Summercat. He collates a lot of the old fanzines, and documents them. Same with Frank Kevin Fifth, which is a TOS project, and he's currently working on. Hopefully, there will be a way to make it publicly viewable. I'm not sure at the moment, but those are like two examples.
There's also ConFuzzled.com, which is run by our partner, the Husky.
Yeah,
there's lots and lots of fan memes and flyers and others down from the area.
one in the back.
It's like definitely people are more closely yes. If you're a student or you know a student who's willing to use their account, then it's like for civil class, unfortunately it is because everything that I see such as an archive of every computer that I'm set online was researched on TV.
Oh wow.
And they say that habit is engaged, as they for no student use their cameras who are a student.
Oh, brilliant. Any more questions?
Yes. What books would you recommend for not just the history of the furry fandom, but furry comics in general? Is there a good history book for that aspect you would recommend?
Oh, off the top of my head, no. I know Fred Patton also did several books on manga, but I'm not something to have on discussing the early days of TMNT or Usagi Yojimbo or Albedo. That would be a good book to cover.
You could
You could write it, yes.
It's possibly.
There's a record on it, yeah. There's something I'm interested in, like graphic novels.
Okay, well, I have unfortunately ran over, but that's kind of all my fault. I've been worried about doing this, but I'm happy to stay for as long as this room's available. If you want to see some behind the scenes stuff, feel free to stay on. But thank you for coming along.
And
then the archive section, and you get straight out of the draw.
Right? Had it on the laptop. They had a thing recent.